So today's event is hosted by the Agile Business Consortium, the professional body for business agility. And we're in our 26th year now. We offer professional development in Agile, a body of knowledge, resources and tools, and a global Agile membership community. If everyone could keep their microphones muted, and please be aware that we are recording this event for the festival archive. I'm pleased to say today that we're joined by Steve Morlidge for his talk on Beyond Budgeting, the Enabler of Deep Agile Transformation. Steve is an author and a thought leader in finance, and he's worked with us at the consortium over the last few years to build bridges between our two communities based on what is a set commonality of philosophies and interests, which Steve will explain more about in this short talk. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and there'll be a part at the end where we can go through and try to answer some of them. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our host, Steve, now, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jade. So what I'm going to be talking to you about, and welcome, I should say. Very rude of me not to say that. I'm going to be talking to you today about a very unagile process, and I'll just explain it to you. It's one where the desired end result is defined in detail in advance, along with the resources needed to achieve it, and as well as the outcome being defined in detail, the plan to get there is also detailed and anchored across time. Involves a high-level governance structure, and the responsibility of that governance process is to monitor progress against the plan, and any variation from the plan or the budget is treated as a defect which needs to be remedied. And if you have to change anything, that's kind of a tacit admission of failure. And so as a result of that, in order to avoid being blamed for failure, for those things outside their control, people tend to build slack into the process. And despite that, the failure to deliver to the required results on time and in budget is rare. Now, for those of you in the Agile community, you might think that I'm talking about waterfall project planning. And indeed, that is one description of waterfall project planning, but actually I'm talking about something much closer to home for me, which is budgets, a budgetary process, because it basically works in the same way and it's based on the same principles. And just like the agile development methodology and philosophies have grown up as a result of a recognition of the defaults of waterfall project planning, Beyond Budgeting has grown up to deal with the problems of traditional business budgeting. So there's a commonality in process, and there's a commonality in terms of the genesis, the origins of the two movements. And indeed, if we go a bit further, we see that just like Agile has a set of principles, Beyond Budgeting has a set of principles. We've got management process principles, which are obviously different because they're dealing with different things. It's dealing with financial resource allocation, but we've got leadership principles. And if you look down the leadership principles, a lot of those, you can see how they mirror and reflect the same kind of sentiments that you'll see in Agile principles. But I think the commonality and between the two things goes much deeper than that, and let me explain. And I think it's much more fundamental. I think fundamentally what we have in common is that we have a common mindset which is distinct and different to the traditional mindset that managers have been brought up in. So and the mindset I characterize as, instead of being obsessed and tied to a plan, we work with a mentality of planning, a continuous process. And that comes from a different set of beliefs about the world and about people between plans and planning, and depending upon those beliefs, you arrive at different conclusions in terms of the way that work should be managed. So with a planning mindset, your assumption about the world is it's potentially predictable, and you assume that people, given freedom, will do the wrong thing. And if you believe those two things, if those are your assumptions about the world, where you end up with is a management process which is based upon centralized control and compliance to plan. If, however, you say, actually, the world that I'm working in is fundamentally uncertain, you can't know for sure in advance. And if you assume that people want to do the right thing, you end up in a very different place. You end up with a management system which is based on distributed control. And the role of leadership is not to manage compliance to plan, it's to guide and support and help people do the right thing. And I think both Agile and Beyond Budgeting share those things. But I really want to talk about this in a big context, which is Agile Transformation, which is, as you will all know, is a big hot topic at the moment. And if you read what's published, and in particular, I'm thinking here of recent articles that have been published in the Harvard Business Review, when people talk about Agile Transformation and Agile organizations, I think they have a very limited sense of what's possible. So I've typically the way that it's described is you have this world of innovation, let's call it, where you employ agile type processes in software development, in product development, and so on and so forth, which is like an agile island where everything works and everybody's nice to each other. And that's separate and distinct from the bulk of the business, which is the part I call the bureaucratic mainland, where, so the argument goes, the business has to be run in an extremely structured top-down manner. And the link between the two, which enables the people on the Agile Island to work unencumbered by these bureaucratic processes, is what I call a resource allocation bridge, where there's some flexibility about how resources are allocated. But I think that represents an extremely limited view of what's possible. And indeed, I think it's possible to conceive of an entire organization that's agile and that isn't bureaucratic. And what lies at the heart of that is dismantling budgeting, traditional budgeting, and the mindset associated with it, which is what underpins the bureaucratic mainland, and which I think people tend to assume is inevitable and can never be changed, which we believe is wrong. So at this point, I'll just give you a brief introduction to myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a finance person by background, so I worked as a finance person in Unilever for nearly 25 years. My last proper job was as financial controller of Unilever's foods business, which is about $1 billion business. But the last 3 years, I headed up a change project where I tried to introduce Beyond Budgeting principles into Unilever. And that's because around about 99, 98, I got into the Beyond Budgeting ideas, and I've worked with them since then, trying to develop them, and in particular, trying to make them practical. So along the way, I've done a PhD in organizational cybernetics. If anybody's interested, speak to me afterwards, which I believe is the science underneath all of this. And I've written a number of books, mainly trying to help people operationalize the Beyond Budgeting ideas. So those are the books that are published. I've got 2 in progress. One, which is dealing with organization, how organizations should be structured. But the one that I'm mainly going to be basing this talk on is what I call a little book of resource allocation, which deals specifically with how Beyond Budgeting and Agile and Lean fit together. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar, let me first give you an indication of how traditional budgeting works. For us finance people, we live this We have lived this, unfortunately, for years. But for those of you who don't work in finance, maybe you don't appreciate it. Basically, the way that it works is that prior to the beginning of a financial year, you have about a 6-month period where you try to build a plan for an organization. And that's a lengthy negotiation because in the process, you're setting targets against which people are going to be judged. So you've got this very bureaucratic process, and which becomes highly political because the way people and their performance is judged is highly is sensitive to the budgets that's set. And once you've set that budget, that is fixed for a year, a financial year. And there's no reason why it has to be. You know, the businesses generally don't work by phases of the moon or the position of the sun in the eye. It's purely a convention. So it's fixed for a financial year, and in theory, nothing can change. Targets can't change. The budget is the forecast as well as the plan. And as part of that process, budgets are allocated. And so theoretically, they can't change either. And during that year, you measure actual performance against that plan, and you generate what we call variances. And if it's a cost and your actual is below that, that's regarded as good, or if the actual is above that, it's regarded as bad, and you're beaten about the head. So it's an attempt to try to force people back to a plan, which, as you know, referring back to the original comments about waterfall planning, that works perfectly if you in a world which is predictable, when you know exactly how you're going to achieve your goal. But increasingly, the world isn't like that. And the fundamental problem with this is that you've got one process called a budget, which is trying to do multiple things. It's trying to work as a target, it's trying to work as a forecast, as a basis for allocating resources, a basis for measuring performance, as a means to coordinate businesses, because everybody in the business does a budget and they all have to add up. And very often the budgets are also used as the basis for rewarding people as well. So you're trying to do 6 actually completely different things with one process. And before I get on to describing the alternative beyond budgeting, it just to help you kind of see what I see, why I think you can characterize beyond budgeting as agile, is that we're both dealing in a context of uncertainty, which is lack of knowledge. We're clear about what we're trying to achieve, but we can't be prescriptive about the means of getting there. And all of our efforts should be guided by an external perspective of value, because at the end of the day, business success is really not about whether you hit the budget, but whether you beat competition. And that in the process, we can have clarity, and we need rigor about what we do next, but not necessarily. We don't want to bake in all of the subsequent steps. We want to have flexibility, and to guide the process and to make sure that we use flexibility in the right way. We need rapid and rigorous feedback, and to act on that, given there's going to be lots of information flowing around the business, which require lots of different people to take action on. That is fundamentally impossible unless you've got trust and teamwork. When everything is moving, you can't manage an organization in a strict top-down authoritarian way. But as well as having trust and teamwork, in order to make trust and teamwork work, we need to have a commitment to sticking to a process and to use a common language and common methodology. So I think that's what makes, in my head, agile, and that I see in beyond budgeting as well. So if I describe in very, very high level terms what beyond budgeting is about, is that instead of a fixed target, you have a relative target. You're trying to beat the competition or to do as well or better than your peers if you're looking internally. The cadence of the process is driven by the business environment. If you're in a retail business which is very fast moving, you might want that your process of managing resources might be driven on a very fast cycle. If you're in the civil engineering business, it might be much slower. Or if you're in the oil exploration business, it might be much slower. The horizon needn't be 12 months. If you're able to respond very quickly to changes in the environment, then your lead time might be very short, much less than 12 months. If, however, the levers you've got at your disposal to steer the business are such that it might take 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, or even longer for those to have an impact, then the horizon you use for business planning and business management might be much longer. So the horizon is driven by lead times. In terms of your forecast, your plan, unlike a budget where the level of detail is exactly the same, whether you're looking 1 month out or 12 months out, the reality is you know a lot more about what you're likely to do in the next few months than in 12 months, 18 months, 2 years' time. So the level of detail at which you forecast will be different at different levels, at different parts of the horizon. And finally, when it comes to monitoring performance, what you're really looking to do is to see whether you're trending towards your target. In effect, like a corporate burn down chart. And whilst you are comparing your forecasts to actuals, you're not doing that as a way of measuring performance. You're using that to as feedback to help you improve your forecast, because the better your forecast, the better your decision making is going to be that is based upon those forecasts. And the fundamental principle here is that for each of the purposes, a target, which is an aspiration, a forecast, which is an expectation, and so on and so forth. Each of those has got different purposes. You have 6 different processes. And what you're trying to do as you move along is to keep all of those things in a kind of dynamic balance. And it's that balance, it's the lack of rigidity, which gives the organization agility and poise. And that agility and that poise is what makes an agile organization, an organization which is best, which is fit to survive in an uncertain environment. So that's about processes. I'm now going to move on to leadership, and there are a number of ways you can talk about this, but this is the way I talk about it, and I want to explore this a little bit more, because I think it's less intuitively obvious and more important. So in a beyond budgeting world, in terms of structure, we're moving away from a system which is based on hierarchy defined roles and which is all about exploiting economies of scale, to one which is more distributed and which is self-organized within limits. And it's based upon the delivery of value rather than hitting plan. The purpose is not about effective execution of plans. It's about defining a purpose and a mission and following a strategy which is designed to achieve those things. And whereas in a traditional organization, authority, which is the ability to make decisions, is concentrated at senior levels, in a beyond budgeting organization, authority is distributed, but it is also clearly defined. So not everybody can decide on everything, clearly. And in terms of control, instead of compliance with plans, rules, and policies, we have goals and we have freedom within boundaries, and fundamentally the best form of control, we believe, is self-control, but with sanctions in place if people abuse the freedom that they've been given. Just like a liberal economy, I mean, we're basically all free to do whatever we want to, unless we break the law. And if we break the law, there have to be sanctions. Yeah, so it's those sanctions which underpin freedom and stop freedom becoming chaotic. In terms of information, in a traditional organization, that tends to run up and down the hierarchy and be based on need to know. In a beyond budgeting organization, there is transparency and there is sharing of information, and people need to find that information they need in order to make the best decisions in their particular business context. And all of that has to be underpinned by a set of values which is based on teamwork, trust, where the leader is a coach rather than the boss, and where you cultivate good judgment rather than a traditional one where it's much more individualistic. Everybody's got their own bonuses which they're trying to hit, maybe at the expense of others, where the leader is treated as a hero and a well-known hero, and where compliance is valued. And if there's one kind of idea which underpins this, it's the idea of self-organization. Now, self-organization is a term that's been bandied around for decades, particularly in the systems community. But I think it's kind of not particularly well defined. And I encounter quite a few people who think it's a bit wishy-washy and unrealistic to think about building a big organization on the principle of self-organization. So I'm just going to take a little bit of a detour just to illustrate why I don't think that this is wishful thinking. So we in our everyday lives, we encounter self-organization all the time without realizing it. And one great example of that is what happens when we go out on the roads. So the entire, with the odd exception where you have a policeman at a road junction directing traffic, everything that happens on the roads is self-organization in practice. And it works most of the time. And I think it's illuminating to appreciate why it works and to relate it back to each of these leadership principles. To start off with, people recognized very early on that you needed to have a set of principles. And that's embodied what in the UK is called the Highway Code. And I think it was the first Highway Code was published in 1926. The example I've got here is from 1930. But it's still in place today. And we have a set of mechanisms to help to manage potential conflicts like roundabouts or traffic lights, depending upon the circumstances. Sometimes roundabouts work better, sometimes traffic lights work better. So we have mechanisms to help manage this self-organizing process. And let's just map each of these against the 6 principles, 6 beyond budgeting principles. So the structure of the system is you have motorways, main roads, minor roads, footpaths. Each of those have different rules associated with them. One of which is if you're driving a car, you drive it on a motorway, main road, or a minor road, not on footpath and not across fields. The purpose that everybody shares and recognizes is we want to get from A to B. Everybody needs to get from their A to their B as fast as possible and safely. So that's the purpose. The authority is most of the decisions are made by individual road users who are qualified to make those decisions. So you have to pass a test, but it can be overridden by signage or the police. And control within this system is self-control, subject to Highway Code traffic enforcement and in extremis legal sanction. And there's tons of information around to help people make good decisions. Road signs, traffic lights, other road users, maps, sat-nav, lots and lots of information freely available to everybody. And it's all underpinned, and it would not work without a consistent set of values that the majority of people recognize and abide to most of the time. So respect for other road users and the safety of road users and pedestrians. So self-organization isn't wishy-washy. It isn't something that happens by magic. It is something that works and can work at scale and can be tweaked in different circumstances. And so it's not wishful thinking. It's not a wishy-washy concept. It is something that can be designed and managed. So that is the big picture, how I think Beyond Budgeting and Agile fit together. Now I want to address a very specific point and a methodological point where I think Beyond Budgeting and Agile traditional agile development fit together hand in glove and helps. And this, I think, will help operationalize beyond budgeting. And I think this will also it will supercharge agile investment, which otherwise lives within what I believe is a hostile environment of fixed budget. So I'm now going to describe a model of agile, which is inevitably very simplified and might horrify you, but if you just bear with me for a couple of minutes, I think it will help. So the way I see agile is that you have an idea, you have a goal, and you have a process that you go to which allows you to iteratively converge on that goal. And the way you do that is that you go through a series of phases. The first of which is more about trying to understand the nature of the problem and the opportunity, which is called discovery. Next phase, which I call alpha, is where you experiment with prototypes and MVPs and things of that kind to confirm that your understanding of the problems and the potential solutions is sound by interacting with real users. And then you've got a beta process by which you iteratively build the solution, all of which is underpinned by a process of rigorous prioritization and feedback from users. So if you're working in an agile investment in a traditional budgeting environment, is you start off with, you're given a pile of cash. And with the instructions there, do what you can with that. Now, this is a resource allocation process, which I think if you're in an agile environment, by definition, you're in a world of uncertainty. But effectively, you've made a commitment of a defined amount of money. When you're making a commitment of a defined amount of money in an uncertain environment, it's just like betting. Yeah. So if your agile project is like a horse, you're putting money on a horse that you might never have seen. You don't know the form of that horse. You don't know whether it likes soft ground or hard ground. You might see it in the paddock, but you might know nothing about it at all. So traditional budgeting effectively forces you to commit to a series of big bets based upon ignorance. And that doesn't make any sense. So beyond budgeting, on the other hand, is a system which enables you, it enables flexibility, it enables agility. You can change your mind based upon what you learn. So here's a way of thinking about it. Uncertainty is the reciprocal of knowledge. And what you're doing as you proceed through each of these steps, discovery, alpha, and beta, and you've got these iterative feedback loops with the ultimate consumer in that loop, what you're doing is you are driving down uncertainty incrementally. And to use the language of betting, it's a bit like when you start off in discovery, you're seeing the horse in the paddock. In alpha, it's got to the start gate, so it isn't lame, and it's got out of the start gate swiftly, so you've got a bit more knowledge. And beta is you're seeing the horse now in halfway through the race, 3/4 of the way through the race. You can see whether it's fallen or not. You can see whether it's at the head of the field or the back of the field. So you've got more knowledge. And in the context of betting, instead of placing a big bet at the start of the race, beyond budgeting gives you the ability to sort of bet in play. So maybe at the start, you make a small bet, which is effectively gets funds the horse to get to the starting gate. When it starts the race and you've got a bit more confidence, a bit more knowledge, you place a bigger bet, but you don't put all of your chips on the table until you've got even more knowledge based upon how the horse has actually performed as it's racing. So in a beyond budgeting world, whilst you might make a plan, and you have to make a plan for the purposes of forecasting based upon what you hope is going to happen, you're actually only making commitments of resources when you have the knowledge necessary to make that commitment with confidence. And the flip side of that is, once you have made that commitment is fixed, whether the commitment covers 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, or 2 years. So you by doing this in the context of knowledge about the project, but also a forecast of what available resources that you foresee you might have in the far distant future, you've got confidence. You've got the confidence that you will make that commitment and you won't have to cut it and do all of those kind of things, which accountants typically spend a lot of time doing, which drives people who are trying to build things nuts. So that's the way I see Agile and beyond budgeting interfacing in practice at a detailed level. So hopefully that's clear. At this point, I want to hand over for questions, and we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. But while you're getting your thoughts together, just to point out a couple of places, if you're interested, where you can go for more information. There is the Beyond Budgeting website. So if you just type in Beyond Budgeting into your search engine, you'll find that quite easily. If you're specifically interested in some of the stuff I've spoken about or any of the books that I've published, if you go to my website, which is sartoripartners.co.uk, and click on the right tab, that will take you to a page which describes the books and points you at places where you can buy the physical book and also buy the ebooks. I'm also, if anybody is willing to help, the book that I referred to earlier, the book on resource allocation, I've currently got circulating in an electronic format with friends and people who I respect, and with a view of encouraging them to give me feedback to help me improve that book before I proceed to formally publish it. So if anybody's interested in helping me do that, please drop me an email, and I can give you a link, and we can open up a conversation. So at which point I will stop talking and hand this session over to Q&A.
Thank you, Steve. I think that was a really brilliant case for introducing Agile and agility into finance and investments, particularly like the analogy of the racing horse. Just having a look at some of the questions that have come through. And we have one from Marja. What would be the time frame you would plan and forecast in an agile way? Okay, so referring back to what I was saying earlier, it's the basic principle that we adopt in Beyond Budgeting is that you should design your control system around the business rather than take a predefined structure and impose it on a business, which is what traditional budgeting does. So a really good example of this, which I think answers this question, is if I refer to Equinor, which is the Norwegian largely state-owned oil company, which used to be known as Statoil, which is a big proponent of Beyond Budgeting. Now, if you look at Equinor, certainly the Equinor of 5 or 6 years ago,
it was comprised of three major arms. There's oil exploration, there is oil refining, and then there is petrol retailing, you know, garages like you see on the roads, Shell and BP and so on and so forth. Now, if you think about it, although those three sets of activities are clearly related, yeah, because the petrol that's sold originally comes from oil that has been extracted from the ground. They're completely different types of businesses. The oil exploration business, you're making huge investments, very speculative, and when you make that investment, you don't know whether it's successful. You won't know for 5 years whether it's successful or not. So you've got a very slow cycle time. You won't make many oil exploration calls in a year, and the lead times are huge. At the other extreme, petrol stations, the investment is minimal, but it's an extremely competitive business where you've got lots of competitors within 5 or 6 miles, all selling fundamentally the same product. You're trying to compete on price and service, and in order to do that, you need to react extremely quickly. So the horizons are very short and the cycle times are very frequent, and that you manage those two businesses in a completely different way. Different planning horizons, different cycle times, different processes, completely different. And the chemicals business is somewhere in between. So the answer to the question is not 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. It's start off by understanding the nature of your business and what it takes you to succeed in that. And then build your control system with the horizons, the cycle times, the processes around that. And what I've kind of been working on since I left Unilever sort of 15 years ago is trying to take those basic principles, which are easy to articulate and are common sense when you talk about it like that, and help finance people operationalize that and build systems which work and which hang together and which are coordinated.
Thank you, Steve. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in now.
Okay, I'll try and answer them more quickly.
No, that was brilliant. So we got a question from Ross, which is, how do you convince traditional CFOs to buy into this approach, considering a lot of them have struggled with the agile approach in IT and business change?
Aha! If you've got the answer to that, please send it to me on a postcard. That is the issue. That is the issue, because what I've described to you, I firmly believe is just common sense. So if you think about the way you manage your own finances at home, you don't build a budget, or if anybody in the audience builds a budget and tries to set a target for the amount of potatoes they buy in July, good on you, but I think you'd be really weird. So what we're really talking about here is a process which makes common sense, but people have the budgeting in the way it's currently practiced has not fundamentally changed in 100 years. Yeah, so it was defined 100 years ago, and we've basically been doing the same thing since. So it's deeply ingrained in people's thinking and in the practices of business and so on and so forth. And secondly, the CFO is and has to be the most risk-averse member of the board, because if you screw up the finances, you go bust. So it's a tough one. It is a really tough one, and there are numerous ways of approaching it. You can do it by stealth. I mean, there's certain things you can do without telling people, and I've got some great stories which I won't go into here about how you can do that. Or you can chop it up or you can do it more openly, chop it up in little bits, run pilots, build confidence that way. But I think fundamentally, and what we've, I think, increasingly come to realize is that in order to really get people to engage in this, we've got to go back to what I was talking about earlier, this mindset point, and to help people to recognize that what they believe is necessary to run a business is based upon a set of assumptions about the world and a set of assumptions about people. They aren't truth. They aren't the truth. They are assumptions. And if you're open to questioning those assumptions, then then a whole new set of possibilities emerge. And I won't go into detail here, but we have ways to help facilitate that process. I think the other thing you can do is to bypass the CFO altogether and target the CEO, who very often is frustrated by bureaucracy, frustrated by his or her inability to get things to move quickly. And if you can persuade that person that you've got something that can help them tackle those problems, then that's one way of persuading the CFO, or at least making it less risky for a CFO to start doing some of these things I've talked about. Because at the moment, if it's just on the back of if it's just on the head of the CFO, that is a very risky, potentially career limiting thing. But if the CEO's got his back, I think that makes it a lot easier.
Thank you, Steve. So we've got lots coming in. I think a good one is, have you seen examples of where the beyond budgeting methodology has been adopted as part of a change program to demonstrate this in action?
Oh yes, lots. I mean, there are small scale ones. We got them in Unilever, which I could share with people. But there are also large ones. And the thing that is great about this is it works. It doesn't just work from the process of reducing bureaucracy. It, as I know from my own experience in Unilever, and that there are other experiences from outside Unilever where whole companies have adopted this, it does transform performance. Businesses perform better. It works. So yes, there is no question that it works. Now, are there ways in which you can screw this up? Absolutely, just like with Agile. But if you get it right, if you understand what you're doing, you understand how you can introduce this in a measured way by managing risk. At the end of the day, you will end up with a set of processes and a way of working that works, which actually generates better business performance. I'm utterly convinced of that.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got 10 minutes left. I'll ask a couple more. Michael's asked, which tools do you perceive as the most helpful in supporting the beyond budgeting approach?
I think the answer to that is it depends. I know this might be very frustrating for people listening to this, but you can't introduce beyond budgeting with a cookie cutter approach. I mean, if you could, trust me, the big 5 consulting firms would have got there 20 years ago, because that's their model. You can't. You have to tackle each opportunity in understanding the context for the business, the political context in the business, the opportunities that might arise as a result of other things that are going on in the business. So, for example, if a business is deeply into Agile and is trying to scale up Agile, then maybe the way you'd approach this is by talking about dynamic resource allocation. And if that idea catches on, dynamically allocating resources generates the need for a whole series of other changes. If we're talking many businesses, if we're approaching this change process from the perspective of finance, one of the reasons that people cite for not wanting to let go of budgets is they feel that budgets give them some kind of forward visibility. So in those circumstances, you might say, well, okay, you don't need a budget for forward visibility. In fact, a budget gives you very poor forward visibility because it's a plan, a forecast made at one point in time in a world which is constantly changing. So in those circumstances, you might talk about rolling forecasting. So it depends. It depends. If you want to do it by stealth, I would argue that the way to tackle that would be to stop variance analysis. And from personal experience, I know that you can stop doing variance analysis and people don't notice because they don't take any notice of it. They know it's stupid. So you can stop variance analysis and use trend analysis. You can use things like control charting type techniques. All of these kind of, there are many, many different ways you can measure performance and help you understand what's going on that work just as well. No, in fact, they work much better than traditional variance analysis, which nobody will do. So it depends on circumstances. And very often, I mean, what we find is that people come to you with their problem, and what we try and do is to find a way of helping them solve their unique problem using beyond budgeting ideas and methodologies. And then if you can do that, then that opens the door to wider and deeper changes.
Thank you. We have Rodriguez who's said about would OKRs be a good approach alongside the beyond budgeting, because you have the 3-month review, but you also have an overall year goal as well. Is that something that you've seen in action?
Yeah, it may be. It may be. So I'm not an expert on OKRs, and I know that one of my colleagues in Beyond Budgeting, who's called Bjarte Borgsnes, who works for Equinor, I know has written articles along those lines. I'm not kind of personally wedded to any specific methodology. If OKRs are big in your organization and that they're not too bureaucratic and they provide the opportunity, they support decentralization rather than centralization, and they are flexible, then absolutely use them, build them. But don't think that by introducing them that automatically means that you're doing beyond budgeting. That's not the case. I mean, for example, Equinor, when they started their beyond budgeting journey, had a lot of experience with the balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard can be, in the way it's implemented, another means of generating fixed targets top down, and you're using the balanced scorecard cascading process to manage compliance on an industrial scale that traditional budget-minded people can only dream of. But in Equinor, instead they took the idea and the concepts behind the balanced scorecard and tweaked them so that it worked within a beyond budgeting environment, so that it became a process that supported devolution and decentralization and helped the process of alignment. So the same fundamental idea, but used in a completely different way, something that Equinor call ambition to action. So the methodology, it's a bit like, it's like any tool. Is a knife a weapon, or is it a useful tool to help you eat food? The answer is it's both. It's a tool, and you can use it to kill people, and you can use it to help you eat. The issue isn't the tool. The issue is how it's used.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think we could all sit here and want to ask you questions for a lot longer as well, but I will wrap it up here. So thank you to everyone who's put their questions in the chat and got involved. And thank you to Steve. We got lots of people commenting saying this has been really insightful and really helpful for them. I've got a feedback form, which I'll put in the chat now. We'd love to hear what you thought about this session. And there's also a link within that which will tell you how you can get involved with our conference, the Agile Business Conference in this October. So yeah, thank you, Steve, for sharing all that knowledge with us and answering our questions. And our recording will be uploaded within 3 days, and we can send you a link if you fill in the feedback form. And I hope everyone enjoyed this, and I hope you all have a great day.